When it comes to addressing the homelessness and housing crisis, the Liberals would be hard-pressed to do any worse. The Auditor General's report on chronic homelessness found that the federal government doesn't even know whether the National Housing Strategy is working to prevent and reduce chronic homelessness, and yet they have spent billions to develop unaffordable housing. On November 15th, 2022, I asked the minister, when will the government do its job so that everyone has a safe and affordable place to call home? The minister responded that he accepts the Auditor General's report and that the government would implement all of the recommendations. Yet in December, the CEO of CMHC, Romy Bowers, confirmed that the government will not meet its targets on reducing chronic homelessness. Her response was that, quote, "It is a very challenging target to meet. The Liberals' failure to lead is only worsening the crisis. Skyrocketing rents are forcing families to choose between food and rent. Shelters are over capacity. Tent cities are expanding. In Toronto, during a recent extreme cold weather alert, 99% of warming center spaces were occupied. Unhoused people are dying across the country. Organizations like the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness are sounding the alarm, calling for greater action to address surging homelessness. Rather than stepping up to support, this government's response is to exclude people who have rent paid directly to the landlord by social assistance programs from receiving the $500 rental housing benefit that the NDP forced them to deliver. These are some of the lowest income people, seniors, people with disabilities, individuals on income assistance, and the government is punishing them. It is absolutely appalling. Meanwhile, CMHC can't even deliver on funds that have already been committed to. Not a single cent of the $420 million for transitional homes and shelters for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people has been released. It's been 2 years since the announcement and zero progress on building these projects. On the Federal Lands Initiative, the government has dispersed only about 11% of the money allocated last year to support urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. The government's website says there's no property available. With the co-investment fund, 115,000 units have received funding commitments, but the funding has not flowed. Projects are sitting there waiting as project costs rise due to inflation. Now the government has introduced a new funding limit of $25,000 per unit for the fund, which means many projects will no longer be viable. I've heard from people say that CMHC is where projects go to die, and sadly, this seems to be the case. What will it take to get projects delivered? The minister calls the co-investment fund the flagship program for deeply affordable housing. Yet in a written response to my question at HUMA, CMHC described the co-investment fund as, quote, as a supply initiative and with an affordability definition linked to the cost of a unit versus market prices. It's not surprising then that the Auditor General found low-income people cannot afford much of the housing being built through this program. The government can't even get its story straight. Some community organizations have projects ready, but have been told by CMHC that the co-investment fund has been depleted. When my colleagues wrote to the minister about seniors' affordable housing project, the minister encouraged them to look into the co-investment fund for support. On the same date, the minister replied to a letter that I wrote, indicated that, quote, the NHCF contribution budget is limited. The left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. When will the government get this story straight and fix the housing crisis?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Notre gouvernement.
Mr. Speaker, our government believes everyone deserves the dignity of a home, and we're committed to ending chronic homelessness. But as my colleague from Vancouver East knows, this won't be easy. It's a complex issue that requires a multifaceted approach. So we welcome the report of the Auditor General, and we agree with its findings and recommendations. At the same time, I want to assure my colleague, and indeed all the people of Canada, that our investments in addressing homelessness are having an impact. Our national housing strategy offers programs that create much-needed homes across the housing continuum with a focus on Canada's most vulnerable groups. Many of the projects we fund include the wraparound supports people need to successfully keep these homes. Infrastructure Canada works together with other federal agencies to realize the success of the Reaching Home homelessness strategy. Through Reaching Home, we're able to support communities to prevent and reduce homelessness in ways that best meet their needs. Other national housing strategy programs are also delivering real results. For example, the National Housing Co-Investment Fund has committed funding to projects that will create more than 121,000 new or repaired units. Since my colleague is from Vancouver, I'll mention a couple of specific projects she'll be aware of. On East Hastings, construction is underway for a new building with 8 stories of housing. It will prioritize housing for Indigenous people with affordable rental units, supportive housing, a healing center, and traditional longhouse space. This was made possible with federal funding and strong collaboration with the province and Indigenous partners. The Co-Investment Fund is also helping create a new shelter for at-risk youth. This second phase of Covenant House, Vancouver's expansion project, will also include on-site services for its residents. Our Rapid Housing Initiative is also responding to the urgent housing needs of people experiencing homelessness or precarious housing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. On November 10th, 2022, our government launched the third round of this initiative. In this latest round, we expect the program will create more than 10,450 units of permanent, affordable housing. As my colleague from Vancouver East knows, the City of Vancouver has received significant investments with each round of this program. For example, we recently celebrated the grand opening of Burnham Place. This 68-unit housing development operated by Coast Mental Health will provide tenants with round-the-clock supports to help them heal, develop life skills, study, and find work. Mr. Speaker, our government's initiatives are making a difference. They're creating much-needed housing and giving vulnerable people the supports they need to stay housed and build a better future.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to point out the housing project the parliamentary secretary mentions, for example, on East Hastings in my riding, just so that the member knows, that project was approved by the city back in 2018. So it's now 2023, and likely, probably, maybe next year, maybe we'll see the project finally deliver housing. It's taken that long to actually get that housing done. And meanwhile, what's happening in the streets of Vancouver? Homelessness. We have unbelievable encampments all littered throughout our streets, people in need and desperate need for housing. So when the government wants to self-congratulate themselves, you will pardon me, Mr. Speaker, it is not good enough. People are dying on the streets, the programs are not being delivered fast enough, and meanwhile, nonprofits are not able to make the projects work as inflationary cost increases, and the government is changing the requirements and the eligibility criteria to reducing the amount of what they can get to get the project off the ground. They're failing the community. They're failing Canadians who desperately need a government to show leadership to address the housing crisis.
Honourable Secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her intervention. There's one thing we both agree on, and that is that more has to be done, more quickly, more effectively, more efficiently, so we share that goal of ending homelessness. I know how serious this is in my riding and how important the national housing strategy is. We need to work faster, more effectively, more efficiently all across the country.